Hello, everyone. My name is Brady Mayer, and this is my presentation on functional mathematics. I made this to help some new teachers who are just coming into the field of special education for a college class to get some better awareness of functional mathematics because it's not really taught at the collegiate level very well, but also for current special education teachers who feel like they need a little bit more direction in the area of functional mathematics, and maybe even for a principal that is tasked with evaluating a special education teacher and has little to no experience in the area of functional math. It can look a lot different to come into a functional classroom after evaluating an entire high school as a principal, and you come into a special education classroom on the functional level, and you're just kind of lost. So I hope this gives you some insight and some ideas on how you can better evaluate your staff and and more importantly, give feedback that helps them in the future. Again, my name is Brady Mayer. This is me right here. And I'm in my 5th year as a functional high school teacher in Illinois, and I absolutely love it. Anything with the students is what I love to do. I'm at the high school level again, so I focus a lot on transition and how we can build skills to meet the needs of my students and their post-secondary ambitions. I've worked specifically hard on my development of my functional math program, because there are a lot of real world skills, a lot of functional skills in the real world that have a huge math requirement. And I don't want any of my students to be held back because of some academics they didn't get, or some academics they got in the wrong context or outside of an environment, and there's a problem with generalization, things like that. I am currently finishing, I'm 1 week away from finishing my master's degree in educational leadership. And I'm excited to see where that takes me in the future. So what is functional math and who is it for? Functional math isn't for everybody, and it's not for every student. Functional math are skills that we use to live independently. So understanding money, budgeting, and telling time all help us do important things like shop for groceries, save for a big purchase, and even catch a bus to work, things like that. Anything that's found in the real world. Math skills and operations that are used in everyday life or build upon each other to be used in everyday life by all independent persons. So a lot of these skills are things that we wouldn't even think much about, skills that we've kind of grown into acquiring, and we haven't had to focus on. But in a functional classroom, we have to really focus on teaching these explicitly so that our students can operate in the capacity they want to in their post-secondary ambitions. I put functional math is reserved for students that need individualized assistance in acquiring, retaining, and generalized everyday math skills. That doesn't mean that these practices won't work extremely well in a general education classroom. For instance, in Southern Illinois, we see a lot of students with low-income backgrounds, a high percentage of students from low-income areas, and we see a lot of students with a lot of really diverse needs. A lot of students who aren't taught those basic math skills, even general education students who aren't taught those basic real world math skills. And so we integrate a lot of the real world math into all of our math classes, and you'd be surprised who needs them. And I think back to my own experience of adulthood. There were things in there were financial demands in my life that I wasn't prepared for, and I had to sit down and study. And thankfully, I'm good at teaching myself. But if I wasn't able to teach myself really well, even if it wasn't my learning style, even if my learning style was having someone else explain it to me or present to me, or I needed to physically do it first, it could have been really challenging for me to avoid financial mistakes and know where I'm going financially in my real world experiences. So especially for students with special needs, specifically an individualized education plan, we have to be very explicit with teaching functional math that leads directly to an outcome. I put no purchase functional math curriculum is going to address all of the students need an entire functional classroom. You're going to have a bunch of diverse students. You're stepping into a functional classroom. If you're stepping into a functional classroom, you know that these students, there's some students down here, there's some students up here, there's some students that can do this, there's some students that can't do this. And then you're going to find that some students have strengths in some areas, but deficits in other areas, and some students are flopped. They have the strength and the deficit, and the deficit and the strength of the other student, and so you're not sure what supports they're missing, or you're not sure what supports better apply to which students. And so it's a process that we build, but having a canned purchased functional math curriculum, I've yet to find one that applies really well to all my students. So there, it comes into that demand of having to create things. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. When we talk about functional math core concepts, we really need to focus on, does the skill being taught directly improve the student's ability to operate independently or supplement future skills? Is it useful? We don't want to waste time, specifically at the high school level. We only have a couple years left with these students, right? And so we've gone sometimes 12, 13, 14 years, sometimes more, of academic skills, specifically for the sake of academics and mathematics. But then we get to high school and we start looking at transition, and none of those math skills are generalizable. None of them are maintained. None of them are being maintained. None of them are being generalized, and none of them are being productive right now because they're not maintainable, they're not generalizable, and they're not specifically what that student needs for their post-secondary ambitions. So we need to look at what the student needs. Is this skill going to be productive in any way for the student now and or after high school? Is this student going to be able to maintain what we're teaching, and is this skill going to be generalizable? So these two, maintainable and generalizable, often go together. If a skill is able to be generalized to a student's real world context, and they're going to be able to use that skill in a real world context, often it's maintained because it's being used more and it's connecting in different parts of the brain. It's not just the academic rote, we're just memorizing and doing. We're connecting this to all different kinds of life functions. So that is the main concept, core concept of functional math. Functional curriculum as a whole. Academics through functional curriculum is what we're looking at. I do, and I'll show you later in my example of, I have examples at the end of this of like a functional classroom, what it might look like, and kind of the groups that I tend to gravitate towards for my functional students to help my curriculum be systematic and clearly progressive to the skills they need. The academics through functional curriculum, though, is where I get students in the beginning, and we don't want to just work on the functional skill because that functional skill has an academic demand to it. So we're looking at academics through the lens of the functional curriculum. So we're looking at, what does a student need and what academics do they need? What functional skill does that student need to access their environment, and what academic skill do they need to access that functional skill, or to be able to do that functional skill? Functional curriculum as a whole as well, not just functional math, but all functional curriculum should be intertwined a little bit, because in reality, even making a purchase at a grocery store is not just a mathematical demand. There's a little bit of a demand of reading. There's a little bit of a demand of utilizing memory and things, and navigating the environment. There's all kinds of demands that go into each functional skill demand. And so when we look at our subjects, they should be intertwined and they should work together. And so I'm never afraid to do a little bit of math in my reading time and a little bit of reading in my math time, because if we're truly going to teach the functional skill well, they're going to have to be intertwined. And just real quick, backward chaining, task analysis, instruction connected to needed skills. These are all things that are very important. In my class, a lot of the times I let my curriculum be, or my instruction be, guided by a backwards task analysis. So I look at where the student needs to be, what skill they need to have, and I take it back into the more specific skills that they're not able to do currently, and I see where I need to teach to get there. And that's really a lot of functional special education, a lot of what functional special education is. The importance of environment. A lot of times we're working with functional students who need some accommodations or need an environment that's conducive for learning. So we're going to make sure that we have sensory needs addressed, that we have attention needs addressed, that we have the supports they need in our classroom environment. And then also mock environments that encourage learning, and not just specifically learning, but learning in a community context in a way that's going to support generalization. And so as many mock environments as I can create is what I do. So we have a mock store environment. We have another mock store environment that's a little bit more like a store. And then we can also go out into the community, into the store, to do some of that learning. So that's just kind of an example of how I use mock environments. I'm easily able to access that basic mock store environment. I'm a little bit less easily, but more easily able to access the more realistic store environment that's open once per day. And then it's a little bit more difficult to access the store environment in the community, but it's also important. And then I put parent involvement down here. I feel like that's such a large topic in the scope of this that I'd have to do a whole entire other presentation, but parent involvement is invaluable in this. I mean, the the benefits that come from solid parent involvement with a student who needs functional training are so vast. If you can get a parent involved in any way and to partner with you to work on these skills in their environment, because we see them in the school environment for 7 hours a day or however long they come to you, but they have them the rest of the time in their real world environment. So if you can get a parent to partner with you and help communicate what needs the student has, help communicate with you, and even I've had parents even come to me and I've helped them create task schedules. I've helped them create visuals that help their students navigate their real world, their real world environments and complete real world activities. And parents, and if again, also on functional math, if the parents know they can count money, they're going to encourage them to count the money in the line at the store in their real world environment, and that's really going to improve things. Evaluating functional special education teachers. So this is specifically for the principals. Research has shown that the majority of functional special education teachers, especially teaching at the high school level, do not connect their students' instruction to grade level standards. This is considered to be a problem because in research it says that full inclusion, and it states that full inclusion is an evidence-based practice that leads students, even students with special needs or disabilities, to complete grade level standards. And I would like to challenge that research because I would assume they used a very specific group of individuals for their testing, not individuals that I see in my functional room. I have students in my functional room that we've worked 15 years to identify numbers, or not in my room personally, but I've seen students in a program before that have worked for 15 years, 16 years, even more to identify numbers 1 through 10, and they still struggle with it, right? And so saying that the issue of learning here, that we can't accurately state numbers 1 through 10 is going to be magically solved by inclusion is just ludicrous. So looking at this, principals, you're going to have classrooms in your school that may be functional special education classrooms where the teachers try to connect their students' math goals with age-like standards, but they're going to have to be highly modified. And so know your district policy and your statewide policy, because if a functional teacher needs to connect their instruction to grade level standards, statewide standards, grade level, I do it for my district because my district wants me to do it, and statewide requirement in Illinois is that I should. And so that's what I do. And I have to make a lot of modifications to that and a lot of accommodations for my student to meet that, but I have them connected in some way. And it's not going to be a direct connection because they're not going to quantitatively reason through numbers in the way that the goal specifically states, but they will quantitatively reason through numbers to the best of their ability. And so it's connected, but not to that high level. And then are grade level standards appropriate for students being taught? My recommendation for this is to always try your best to get your student to that grade level standard, unless it's going to be harmful to them. If I took someone who didn't know their numbers 1 through 10, a student who couldn't count 1 through 10 accurately at all, and then said, okay, we're going to an algebra class because we're all about inclusion and you have to meet that state standard, that doesn't make any sense, and that's going to be harmful to everybody involved, especially the student. It's not going to be helpful to them, and that's what our goal is. And then another thing that you can evaluate from the teacher is each student receiving individualized instruction? This is a key. I've observed functional classrooms in the past that a general worksheet is passed out to all the students and it's not been productive. Individualized education is the definition of special education, but especially in the functional classroom, we're not going to have 10 students with the exact same mathematical needs. They're not going to be on the same progression towards their transition goals, and they're not going to have the same abilities. So there needs to be a high level of individualization in instruction, in accommodations, and in the curriculum. Another thing to look for is the instruction connected to each student's agreed upon annual IEP goal. As you should know, IEP goals are legal requirements. So they're legally binding. IEP is a legally binding document, and when you state that you're going to work on this goal, you have to work towards it. So one thing that a principal should do is they should attain the IEPs, compile all the math goals, and see if the instruction's matching up with those. Not that every single instructional period has to match up with the IEP goals, because if we're going to work on one specific goal the entire year, that's going to be a little bit reductive. So we need to work on a broad range of skills, but they should still connect to an annual IEP goal, at least consistently. And then last, even if the curriculum is not aligned directly to same age state standards, for instance, a curriculum that you'd buy or you'd purchase, the curriculum and instruction designed should be systematic and progressive. So you can evaluate, you can ask the teacher, you can say, hey, I love this lesson. Where are you going next? And what's the year-long application of this? Where do you keep going? Do you have a curriculum that is systematic and progressive? Do you have instructional strategies that you're working on, fading out supports and things like that? So that's another evidence-based way to ensure that your special education teachers are performing the way they should in the functional classroom, and some tips to help evaluate them. So just real quick, some evidence-based practices for teaching functional academics. I have tried all these. I use them actively in my classroom because they work really well, and they're also backed by research, not just one research, but a lot of research. You can see I've referenced Pearson here a lot. Pearson, this study is basically a meta study. It studies a lot of studies and compiles the evidence-based practices. So the first is systematic instruction and curriculum. We just talked about that. Is the curriculum being used to connect to real world skills? Is the academic skill being taught going to connect further on down the line? And is it scaffolding in nature? We don't want to just do things that are loosely connected. We want to find a skill and teach a larger functional skill, teach the academic skills that lead to the acquisition of that functional skill. And we need to see that. We need to see it scaffolding and supporting that student higher and higher and higher. Community-based instruction. That doesn't have to be in the community, but is the skill being taught applicable to necessary life skills? So is it relevant? Are you able to teach the math skill through practicing a real-world skill? So are you able to better teach this? It's approved practice to teach skills to functional special education students in the context, the maximum amount of context you can acquire of the real-world skill. So, for instance, can you use a physical bill when you're teaching money skills? Do you have those resources? Do you have the ability? Can you teach it in a mock store environment? Can you teach it in the actual store environment? Can you do that as much as possible? And so that's what we're doing. We're teaching that as much as possible in the real world context. And then can you teach the skill in a mock or real world environment? We hit on that a little bit just before this. Can we walk down to the Dollar General and get in the Dollar General and actually practice doing what we've practiced in the mock school environment? Those are all things that have been proven to increase the functional skills acquisition of students with disabilities. And then visual and physical aids, these should be obvious. Are real world objects, money being used as much as possible? And are the visual physical aids used supporting students and supporting student learning and generalization of the academic skill to a functional skill? So we can use them in those two contexts. And then we want to fade those visual and physical aids out as quickly as we can to increase independence. Then we've got task analysis instruction. So this is basically all functional special education for me, is that we're looking at skills that the specific student needs for their context. We're looking at each student's ecology, right? And we're looking at the skills they need in that ecology. We're writing a task analysis for every skill they need to be able to do to build up to completing that functional skill within their context, within the context that's going to benefit them. And then we're doing step-by-step instruction that breaks down the larger demands. You can ask yourself, is a student being held back by an individual step that hasn't been taught yet? A lot of times I see teachers that say, oh, well, they can't do this, or they can't do this, or this, or this. And I say, wait, have they done this yet? And they say, oh, well, no, they can't do this. Why would they be able? And I say, well, that's a step. You can't do, for instance, I've seen teachers in the past that just say you need to do division, but they never teach any ways for students to do division. And they say you can't use a calculator, you just got to figure it out. But the student doesn't even know multiplication. So how can they connect they they can't connect multiplication facts to division facts and things like that. That's just one example. But another, for instance, would be just expecting a student to brush their teeth, but they're not yet able to, or they're not yet used to, or haven't been taught how to hold the toothbrush correctly. We're not going to go to the larger. If we have a problem with the larger, we're going to go to the more specific skills and focus on those. One practice that's been proven to work really well is video prompting, teaching each step in a larger demand, one video at a time. This often utilizes an iPad, and the student can often navigate it independently. And so specifically students with autism really thrive on this, where they'll get it on an iPad and they'll have one video, they complete that portion of the skill, one very specific portion, they scroll to the next video and they have visual, audio, video instruction on exactly the next step to do. They complete that step and they go on. And then what you do is you go back and you try to take out some of the steps to create it strategically where it's increasing their independence, and eventually, hopefully, they can get so much fluency in that skill they don't need the video at all, and it can generalize to their real life. A good way to ensure academic skills are directly connected to functional demands. So if you want to make sure that your skills are actually connected to the functional demands of the student, do a task analysis and see. And backward chaining prompts, we just want to make sure that we're increasing independence as much as possible. So this works in all areas of the support you give students. I even include this in my sensory supports. Sensory supports are not always going to be able to be given in a real world context, in the real world. And so if there's any way that student can function without those sensory supports, that's the goal. Specifically for anything that's non-academic and we're not trying to learn in that moment, I'm pretty consistently trying to push my students to become more able to function in an environment that's not specifically catered to every one of their sensory needs. Now, I don't ever push my students in an unethical way that would make them anxious or uncomfortable in an unethical way, but I just am realistic. And in the real world, if we always supported every single one of their sensory needs or every single one of their auditory processing needs, things like that, then they jumped into the real world, it'd be too overwhelming. And so realistically, I want my students to be able to jump into the real world and just be able to access anything they want to access. So we'll go over this mock class real quick to give you some examples. I created this mock class to just kind of give you a setup of if you're a principal or if you're a new teacher, this is what your classroom may look like, or this is what you may be observing. Each functional class is going to have a wide range of students with different academic and functional abilities. That includes physical abilities, that includes academic abilities on all levels. So typically, I split my math hour into 3 groups, and within those 3 groups, each student is working on the exact demand that they need at that time. So I'm not holding everybody to the pace of another student. That's not productive. Every student has to have individualized instruction, but they kind of generally fit within these 3 groups so that as far as staffing goes, we don't have an individual aide for each student. That's unnecessary, but we do have 3 individuals who are focusing on a pretty specific type of support for the students in their group, and you'll see how that kind of works out. As far as classroom layout, I'm strategic in this. You got to think about, as far as academic time goes, specifically academic math time, students are looking for ways to get distracted. Students are easily distracted. Students can be made upset quickly because sometimes it can be frustrating. So my classroom layout's very specific and individualized to each student's needs. And the groups typically are in different places in the room apart from each other so that no matter what we're doing in that group that day, we have what we need. And I might talk about later, some groups I have specifically strategically placed by a whiteboard, because often I'll teach off a whiteboard for them, and other students I have strategically placed in another portion with smaller whiteboards because they need more individualized instruction rather than group instruction. And then functional environments, I'm taking these students out in the functional environment as much as I possibly can. We're increasing that functional environment outside of the classroom or even within the classroom and creating a mock real world environment as much as humanly possible. Group 1 is often counting and identifying numbers. If you can't count and identify numbers, most of the other functional skills are out the window. It's hard to utilize money if we can't count and ID numbers. So we're working on all kinds of skills with that, and that's typically my first group. And I don't do a whole lot. I do a little bit of group instruction in this area because a lot of the students need a lot of rote counting, a lot of object counting like you see in this picture. And I put all these things because we're going to do this in every single group. They have a fairly large range of needs. And even within this group, sometimes I'll have a student who can count their numbers really well. They can count objects really well, but they need help with skip counting or some skills that will move them up to the next level. And so they'll be doing their own work to the side as well as joining into the group a little bit. Curriculums, you have to create a lot of your own. You're pulling from different curriculums exactly what the student needs. And as long as you show that it's scaffolding, it's building to a skill that is necessary, that it's systematic and structured, it's evidence-based. Because just sticking to one curriculum is never, ever going to meet the needs of every single functional student in your room. Make sure you adapt the curriculum. And when you're creating curriculum, when I create curriculum, I specifically, one of my main thoughts is, can I adapt this? And I work hard to make it as adaptable as possible so that it's not just a one-lane curriculum. I'm not creating 15 different curriculums. I at least have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 curriculums that I'm able to adapt into 15, 16 different demands, or to meet 15 or 16 students' specific needs. Progress and progress monitoring is super important in this group, because a lot of times 1 through 10, counting numbers 1 through 10 can become extremely monotonous, and it doesn't look like you're making much progress, but at the end of the year you realize that you've increased 70%, right? So you have a student that counts 1 through 10 correctly 10% of the time, 1 out of 10, and then at the end of the year they're still making mistakes, and you see those mistakes, you're like, man, we've been working so hard, they still can't get this number, they still can't get this. But in reality, they've made a 60% improvement because they're now at 70%. And so that's one of the reasons it's really hard. It's really important to track progress and progress monitoring, and also to see whether you need to switch up your instructional styles. A lot of students need some hands-on instructional styles to make progress in this level. And then functional applications, make sure you're connecting this to every functional application you can. A lot of my instruction in this group never diverts from the functional application. So we don't work necessarily with worksheets. We work more with objects that are functional objects that they might see in the store, so that we don't even have to focus. We don't even have to think about generalization. We're generalizing right now, and we're using all the supports we possibly can. Group 2 may look like a math operations and functional preparedness group. So you're looking at, we can count numbers, we can skip count, we can do some counting, but we haven't applied those at all to anything functional, and we've got some time before those functional skills have to be perfected before we move into transition. That's this group. And so we look at curriculums that are systematic scaffolding to functional skills. And I put this picture because this is really important in this group. It has to be systematically scaffolding to the functional skills, because we need to build a ton of academic base to refine those functional skills later. And then we want to do a gradual release. We're constantly supporting the student when they're starting to struggle too hard, but then they pick up on the skill, and then we pull back as quick as possible so that independence is increased. Progress and progress monitoring. At this group, again, I'm doing most of the progress monitoring, and I'm monitoring that progress super intensively, so that if I see somebody hit a plateau, usually in this group, students are growing pretty consistently, but if I see somebody hit a plateau, that's going to be my instructional focus. I'm going to do everything I can. Immediate feedback, error correction method of teaching, instructional teaching with different creative ways. I'm going to start using the smartboard. I'm going to start using video modeling that they can operate on their own. I'm going to start using physical resources, tactile, anything that I can use to help that student. I'm going to start just being super creative because they've hit a plateau and we need to find a way to go forward. And then explicit functional application in the functional environment. So this is where, when students get into this stage, I really ramp up that life skills practice. So we don't just count money, we don't just add or subtract money, we do it in the real world context, like you're going up to a cashier, like you're paying a bill, and things like that. And the last group would be advanced functional operations and generalization of skills. These are typically my students who are nearing their transition out of high school, and we've got all the academic base that we can get right now, and being academic for the next year or two would just be for the sake of being academic. So we work really hard on that functional application of the academic skills. So we're looking at, again, it's got to be to their specific needs and their post-secondary ambitions, and then we're gradually releasing them into the real world literally at this process because it's the transition time. And so that mathematical environment has to change to a very transition-focused functional environment as much as possible. So this group, every single day, instead of working on a worksheet, they're typically going and working on physical functional skills that they're actually going to be able to apply into real life. And I also make them do their own progress monitoring. They do all of their own progress monitoring. So I make them write down the skills that they need for their to function in their life. And at this point, they usually know them well because we've taught them for so many years what they do need. They know what they do need, and I say, "What skills do you need? Can you do that yet?" And they're monitoring, and they get really excited. Usually, they say, "I can do this. I can make purchases. I can work as a cashier. I can do A, B, or C." So that's the point there. That's the progress and progress monitoring, and that's what they're going to do after high school. They're not going to have a teacher to sit there and say, you got to do this, got to do this, we got to get better at this. They're going to have to be able to look at their own skills and see the skill they need, and at least be able to ask for help and maybe even practice a little bit on their own. Functional applications continues to teach and expand. So we need to make sure that those functional applications are still being hit really hard in our life skills classes, that the academic demands that we see in the functional skills need to be taught explicitly, but we're trying to make sure they're in that functional application process. The overall goal of functional math is just to give each student the ability and opportunity to access their real world environment to the maximum extent possible. And that's all we've talked about today, is just seeing every single student get to the best of their ability and access as much as their environment as they possibly can. And then I don't want to see, personally in my class, I don't want to see any student held back by their lack of math skills. And that's the point. That's the whole point of doing academics for years and doing those academics in the scope of functional skills, is so that we can see students go into their functional environments, go into transition with more math skills than necessary, that they're operating in as many life functions as possible with that support of some acquired math skills that we've worked hard to get. And these are some of my references. These are all really good research papers that are really, this isn't a research paper. This is just a definition I found, but these three are really good research resources that you can look at, specifically this one right here, Special Educators Math Instruction for High School Students with Significant Intellectual Disabilities by Pearson. This one has some really good, page 63 through 68, I believe, has some really good practices that I showed above with a little bit more substance than I gave. So thank you so much for listening to this. Again, my name is Brady Mayer. And if you ever want to reach out to me, please feel free to reach out to me through any platform that this is on, through LinkedIn or through YouTube. I would love to help you out, or even Teachers Pay Teachers with my free stuff on there. I would love to help you out, or if you're a principal that needs a little bit of more explanation of how to give feedback to your teachers and this presentation isn't enough, feel free to contact me. I would love to get in touch with you. Past that, I'm going to try to post this whole entire presentation in the comments so that you are able to access it whenever you need. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you got something from our video today.